comfy. We'll now invite all of our speakers to come back up. And if there's more questions that have come up in hearing the multiple themes across talks, we can have a bit of a discussion amongst the speakers, allow them to ask questions of each other, and so on and so forth. If you would like to sit down, you're welcome to bring a chair, or if you want to stand, we can. All right.
Hi, I just want to say thank you to all of you guys. As an AIM crew member who collects the data, it's really cool to see the data like in motion and working on projects. And I had a question, I guess, specifically for Terry. Does the app, does it use the AIM data? And if not, do you think it would be beneficial as an AIM crew member? Would it be encouraged or discouraged to use the app while out on plots?
So it does not use the AIM data. It's compatible, so you're using similar methodologies. I don't think you should collect it because it would be kind of double counting in some ways. It's meant for somebody else to go out there and collect something similar that could be compared to the AIM data.
Okay, as I've listened to all of you, I hear a common theme about putting things together and making that available to more people, and that occurs to me as a great way to develop policy and all those sort of things. But in the context of shared stewardship, we manage lands on surprisingly small scales. And having monitoring data and shared monitoring data that can be used at that small scale where they're making that decision about what they need to do, I think is kind of a place we're kind of missing. And when we talk about big data, it's hard to take big data down to making a decision about what's happened here on my place, in my riparian pasture, and knowing what I need to do in my circumstance.
That's a question for you, Brandon. You have big data.
Kind of sounded a little bit like my talk. Yeah, I mean, I think that is the challenge that we're facing. And AIM is part of the solution, the systematic monitoring. In terms of getting more points, that's land PKS. So if we can get people out there to gather the data in the places where they want the field data, that would be the tool that we could use to try to fill in those spaces between the AIM points. And then the other piece is the remote sensing. If we can train machine learning models with these data and actually get gridded, fine scale, 30-meter resolution information on plant production, which actually ends up working pretty well at the Jornada. Matt Reeves' rangeland production tool from the Forest Service actually does a pretty good job of estimating production continuously across the Jornada. And if we can do that also with the RAP tool for vegetation cover and composition, we have a start. You don't look convinced.
I didn't make the point. I'm speaking my outside voice, and I don't need a microphone, I don't think. Okay, I'm making a good. My case is that monitoring needs to be more of a business process rather than a scientific process when it comes to talking about management and local levels. And that's my own crusade, I guess. And I have so many people tell me, well, what does this really mean? I give you all this data and you take and, marry it together with all this other stuff, but how is that useful to me? Let's talk about what I did, what's happening now, and what's going to happen tomorrow. Okay, that's what happened yesterday, and yeah, I contributed to science and all that stuff, but I need information about what's happening now, what could happen in the future, in my place, my riparian pasture, the place I'm trying to develop better fish habitat. That's my stump speech. Thank you.
Yep, no, I'm with you, and I think we're getting there with the tools. I still think we need to have more collaborative groups, and we need to have scientists to help shepherd this process and make the data available. Some of the web tools, they're going to help, but I still think we need some way of scaling up the groups of people that can interpret the data.
I'll add to that quickly. Oops. The adaptive management workshops that we're hoping to do, we're hoping that will help teach ranchers how to set good goals, collect data so that they can see where they're going towards, whether they're going towards their goals or not. So having not just a tool, but a way to interpret that tool and use it on the ground, I hope will be useful. And my goal in those workshops is to provide a template and structures that they can use so that anybody can use that. It's not just something I've created and only I can present it, but that a collaborative group can use it. Sorry. Anybody else?
Scientists aren't really good at giving direct answers. And you want like a direct answer like this happened and do this. And the idea of small local data, big data, I think they're both really important and you have to have them integrated. But we have to be able to make land management decisions based on that data. And that's really hard with big data. And 30-meter resolution sounds great, but a lot of the riparian areas we work in aren't 30 meters wide. So like that scale doesn't work for us when we do remote sensing data often. We need like 1 meter or even higher resolution data to be able to make those decisions. But I guess my point is we got to do both and we got to figure out how to make them compatible, but we got to make sure that you can get land management decisions out of that are useful to the practitioner, to the agency, to the manager, and also to the permittee or whoever's using that land for their livelihood. Anyone else want to tackle that?
Maybe just a quick comment. I mean, I think that, like what was mentioned, like we have all these new different data sources, and you can throw them out there, and in the soils world, like people don't really know how to use them until you actually like go out and like train people, because like change is difficult and change takes time to learn. If you have different types of data products. But on the flip side, at least from the soil mapping side, which I can speak to, like there's been a lot of generalization that's been hard for people to deal with in classic soil survey, and so even getting to 30 meter gives like somebody on the ground a lot better inference on their piece of ground than they could get before without having to do a lot more interpretation of the data. So another piece of the puzzle there.
Hi, a concern that I have so I'm an ecologist. I remember several years ago at a soil science meeting, there was a question for the head of the Cornell Soil Health Lab, and someone asked, does the soil health metrics relate to row crop production? And the answer was, if I recall correctly, not very well. And I think that stunned a lot of the audience. And so the point I guess that I'm trying to get at, a lot of the rangeland soil health concepts are derived from what we know from row crop agriculture. So if they don't work that well in row crop agriculture, should we keep measuring them in rangeland? So a lot of the speakers, so I don't have a comment directed to a specific speaker, but a lot of the speakers talked about collecting data. And a lot of the indicator data is soil data. Do we have, but I guess what I didn't hear a lot of was, are we collecting things that are going to be meaningful to ranchers? So we had the prior question of like local site information. So how useful is this data going to be? While it sounded like lots of you were advocating people collecting stuff it seems like there's a lot of uncertainty on the utility of those data.
All right. Yeah, yes, I mean, to me, like, obviously there's a lot of different things a lot of different data you can collect in a system to try and like help make a decision. And there's a lot of very system specific stuff. And so I think that's where the conversation between scientists and researchers and people on the ground need to continue, because I mean, I think that like with thinking about like the monitoring data we've all been talking about here, there's definitely been some consensus in a lot of communities that have brought this program together that they're meaningful. But yeah, what the inference of the type of data that we're collecting, how far out that goes into what systems, you know, you always have to think about that, and that's where I think kind of merging conversations between user groups is super important. So I guess that's my shot at that question.
I'm not going to answer so much directly, but one aspect of the grant that we received, we have a Rangeland Social Science graduate student who actually is going to ask the question about the Land PKS app, what would be more useful to the ranching community? So what information don't you have that would be more useful? Have them use it, get feedback from them to try and make it as useful as possible for them. And if that's new information, we will see if we can incorporate that into the app. But it may be more about how it's presented or how to interpret the data too. So we're hoping to have more of that information and feedback from them to make it as useful as possible.
I just wanted to comment about application on the ground and very small scale, information, from using data collected or bigger data and evaluating what's going to help my spot. And I deal with that a lot with very small parcels, 2 to 3 acre disturbances or long linear disturbance. But it's in the picture of a big landscape, it appears at first as, oh, it's just on my postage stamp. How can I influence that little spot? And I think we have to take the data that's available, and I really look forward to seeing how Sean DeStefano's research and utilizing the mapping overlays and things like this to determine what potential that site has based on all the data that you guys are working together. But in terms of reclamation that I need to know if I do A, B, and C, will it result in this? And those good results of data collection hopefully will provide another layer. So not only you have data of what that site is doing, but what caused it to get that good or what caused it to be that bad. And so I think there's the cause and effect issues that we're going to have to look at a bigger scale.
I work in a field office and, work on the ground primarily in, range allotments that can be pretty large, but also trying to focus in on smaller areas. And we encounter that problem a lot. And I think my goal or the next kind of frontier for this research is really to the integration, I guess, and building reports and integrated tools that talk to one another, and then we can start looking at things kind of as a whole, and taking these amazing different products that are, from different disciplines and combining them into, one report or multiple reports that kind of give us that extra level of inference. And for me, it comes down to building the workflows that actually allow us to do that, not just throwing it all on one sheet of paper or something like that. So.
I guess one question we can tell you from the big collaborative project we've been doing is we need to match the monitoring to the objective. Right? We can do all kinds of standardized things, but what's the objective of the project? Is it wildlife, vegetation, livestock production? Get the right metrics and then match the monitoring to that. You do that at the local scale, and then you find creative ways to scale that up using remote sensing, etc. But if you don't match that, you're not going to know whether or not you met that objective.
What kind of outreach program are you doing to get this information out to the rank and file ranchers, and especially to build a trust level in a lot of the new techniques that you're looking at for monitoring the PKS, all the different carry it in your phone pocket type of stuff? How are you getting out to the guys that don't attend the state cattlemen's or state wool growers meeting?
what we're planning on doing is these 20 workshops, and we're reaching out to a lot of different people to see if they want to host those workshops. That's one way. My co-author, Jeff Herrick, has also been talking with Public Lands Council, other organizations at that level, but we're just now starting to have this application being used in the U.S. It's been used in Africa and around the world, more so than in the U.S., so it's new to being used here. So we wanted to also get the privacy function available before we started rolling it out, so that we knew that was very important to a lot of people. So that's now in place, and we're in the process of getting the habitat output module set up. Once that's available, the workshops will start in the fall. So for that information, I'm not sure how else he's planning on promoting it, but if you have other suggestions, we would welcome that.
Just have a quick comment on that. I mean, for like kind of these new kind of mapping products and stuff, our model is kind of working with the people, well, with like the field staff and the BLM who work with partners on the ground. And so the idea is that, you know, you get that information disseminated through that network, which is really what we need to keep investing in, and perhaps I would say haven't invested enough in, is having that kind of applied staff staffed well enough across the board, you know, in all these systems, so that you get that information transfer. I'm sure there's more pieces to that puzzle, and you know, part of like what we're doing is making sure whatever final product we have gets into Edit, which then is connected to Land PKS, so that we're all kind of integrating these things together. And I think, you know, and then you think about the landscape commons for the data, and so that's like, you know, you kind of have to knit it all together to then be able to get it out, you know, in a systematic framework. And then you know, have to kind of iteratively fill in the gaps as you see gaps, you know, kind of materialize in that workflow, I think, is kind of how I see it. Thanks. So the project I was a part of in Gunnison, it wasn't a data accumulation, data distribution analysis project, but we kind of did it the old-fashioned way. We walked the site with the ranchers, with the permittees. We often had hydrologists, wildlife biologists, compliance people, the rancher out there with us talking about it before we did the work, after we did the work. We also did a bunch of workshops that were funded from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. But it was really hard to get ranchers to attend a lot of those. It's just a really busy time during the field season. So we also tried to do things off the kind of field season when it's not calving, and it was really hard to find a time that was appropriate for the ranchers, but we did things where we actually did trainings for the methods, so how to do the structures, how to run the equipment, especially the bulldozers, the front loaders, things like that, and tried to get them trained up on the methodologies. But as far as the data feedback to the ranchers, it was minimal, and it was really much, from the quantitative sense, it was much more like we went out there and walk the land with them as much as possible. And to be honest, from the planning side of the projects for the restoration work to the completion of it, the best thing for everyone was getting a small group of people out there walking the land together. And I got to say, personally, it was a huge educational experience, something I think myself and all the other people really enjoyed.
Yeah, Nels, in our project, we have the 4 ranchers. You saw Jeff Whaler today. They're actively involved in the project throughout the whole thing. Now they're collecting the data. We're providing it to them. We've learned how to provide, you know, that data in a way, a format that they like to see, and they're very interested in it. And I think it's been very humbling as a scientist. We talked about humility in this entire SRM annual meeting. Humbling to be able to see how that's learned, how they take that data from us, and then they push us to the limits of what other data should we be collecting that we're not. And we've made the efforts to collect that data for them, Nels.
I appreciate the effort and everything you're doing. We've done the same thing on a local basis, one-on-one. We reach a couple people, but we're not getting that word out. And being a part of Public Lands Council, we've been hammering on them for 25 years, the value of monitoring, and we just keep banging our heads against the wall. And we've got to get it out there. Now, with the technology that you're talking about, the fear factor has jumped way up. So it's a big, big chore, and we need to work together on it. And I thank you for, I know we're trying, but it's going to be a tough one.
So I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this. and I don't know if it is through something like the NPKS or when we get to a platform to compile the big data into an effective way to pull information, but it seems like there's this almost barrier to entry for we've got all this data, what do we do with it? And then there's also the time aspect associated with monitoring, and monitoring is supposed to be the over time to capture your objectives and see where you're going, especially as you try new things on a landscape. And getting at this local level, is there any thought as to whether we could add things like tags to an app for objectives where, you know, we're gathering this data on this site for this objective to, and then now you have your slew of looking at other areas or other locations similar to yours where people are trying to do the same things. What is working over time? What's not working over time? But are there ways to, does anyone have any thoughts on how we can better filter out all of this data so it doesn't seem as overwhelming and as barrier to entry with, well, we have it, but I don't know what to do with it. What are other people finding as they do these different monitoring techniques?
Emily and I were trying to step back and listen from all of our amazing presenters, but I think that that is absolutely one of the gaps that as we move forward in building this shared language of monitoring and using monitoring as a way to have a dialogue and learn from each other, we absolutely need to not only store the monitoring data themselves, but the objectives, as Justin was talking about, and figuring out a framework and a platform to store those objectives is a really sticky wicket, and I don't think we have a good universal solution, but I guess I would turn that back to this group, both with your question and the question before of these are really challenging problems that, you know, a group of scientists cannot solve, but the community of rangeland managers, we can come together to solve this. And so how can, you know, let's continue this conversation past this session and start identifying this is a real need, which it sounds like we have on multiple levels identified the need. And so then the question is, how do we solve this? And, you know, the solution is partially going to be technological in terms of tagging data and things like that, but then also the solution is social in terms of how do we communicate the types of land management actions that occur on our lands, and how do we have discussions around those. And I think it's a really important problem that we've identified, but I'm hoping that everyone in this room goes away from this session, and I know I feel like I've learned a ton, and so you go back to the people that your social networks, and we can continue these discussions and come back again next year and have this conversation, and hopefully we'll have moved the ball forward, and it's just going to be that iterative social process, I think.
You go ahead first. Go.
So we've been talking about a process like this in linking the EDIT database that contains the ecological site descriptions to the NRCS conservation planning process, which already kind of has a logic kind of laid out. So you could imagine if you're starting with, okay, I did an evaluation, my land is in this ecological site, it is in this state, now what do I want, where do I want to go, and what do I, what indicators do I need information on, and then having something that goes out and grabs those data for you. But having more of an interactive, web-based process for querying and simplifying a big data set to something that you need to make a decision is something that we're talking about.
So I know I flashed through very quickly, but for the wildlife, I keep saying wildlife, the habitat output module, it has an indicator of what habitat looks like and what your data looks like, so you can compare whether you're, and it will keep track of if you've collected data over time, whether you're getting closer to that or farther away. That's one way you can use that information. It has been suggested that could we do that more broadly throughout Land PKS, and I will take that back to the developers and make that suggestion again. It's not the total answer, but it would be one way that if you had an objective around bare ground, if you're already collecting bare ground in the app, you could then see whether you're getting closer to your objective or not over time. And there's ways where it does track trend over time, so that might be something that would be doable in the future. So I'll definitely take that back to them.
Can I ask a quick question that might summarize all this real quick? Sure. It's for big data. So part of that was brought up in several different ways, but the gentleman from Public Lands Council, they've been hammering, everybody's been hammering on monitoring for years. And, it's necessary, but by nature, monitoring is hindsight. It seems to me that the gap and the opportunity lies in being able to use machine learning to have predictive capabilities. So then it becomes useful for people and you can narrow that gap. I'm just asking, is that something that you're seeing more and more of? Is that something that's being considered through all this?
I don't think that one's
not on anymore. Okay. I think mostly the machine learning is about getting more real-time information. But in terms of forecasting, it's not anything that, there's certainly the ability to do that, but I don't know of any examples where that's happened. However, the state and transition models, so if you see a trend in monitoring data, for example, and you have some idea of where there may be nonlinearities, there may be thresholds, and you see the data approaching it, and you contextualize that trend in terms of the state and transition model, that can give you a little bit of an idea of what might come next. And so that's really, I think, where we're doing a lot more progress.
Yeah, that was my question. Are people thinking about foresight now?
I mean, there are a couple examples of people kind of building on Brandon's comments that are actually turning state and transition models into kind of process-based, like forecasting models, thinking about scenarios. Particularly, you can do it with drought scenarios and climate scenarios and stuff like that. So it's definitely on people's radar. And I know part of our STM development process will be looking kind of back in time, with all the plot data that exists out there, kind of coming up with what the current state is, and looking back in time with a lot of these Landsat-derived kind of indices and stuff, and looking if where we can identify actual state changes, thinking about the drivers, thinking about the time frames, to really help better parameterize and help people understand what those kind of thresholds and timeframes of those thresholds are. So that's definitely maybe not exactly using machine learning, although you could kind of incorporate it into certain nodes of those frameworks. So there is a lot of applications that are kind of emerging, but definitely R&D stage as far as all the stuff that I'm aware of.
I will just say that this whole field of near-term iterative forecasting, I would say, is emerging in ecology as a very immediate need. But I don't think we're ready for management prime time on that. But folks are starting to think long and hard about that. Great. Well, thank you to all of our presenters. This has been a fantastic set of sessions, and is very exciting to see how data and monitoring and collaboration are all coming together. Despite the fact that Emily and I organized this was not intended to be an AIM session. So we did not, Casey provided a great overview of AIM, but we didn't really lay much groundwork in terms of what the AIM program is. So if you've heard this word AIM throughout the session, but you're kind of confused about what it is, the BLM AIM program has just produced a fact sheet that summarizes the program and how you can collaborate and get engaged. So we have those up here, and we would love to share them. We'll stick around for questions and have more discussions. But thank you all so much for your time. This has been a great session.